Welcome to 5 Good Minutes.
You're listening to today's inspirational message
On the book of Romans with Kurt Bjorklund.
This week we are in Romans chapter 6, verse 15 through 23. And this passage is one that uses an evocative image. It speaks of slavery. And typically in the United States, for good reason, we don't like the idea of even thinking about slavery a whole lot with some of the past transgressions around that. And it's just an unpleasant image. But here's what this says, verse 15 and 16. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law, but under grace? And then he says, by no means. This is that me genoito. If you've been around during this series, you've heard me talk about this phrase. It's a phrase that Paul uses as a way to express abhorrence. So he's saying, may it never be. May you never think, should I sin as a way to basically acknowledge that I'm not under the law, but under grace. So here he's addressing this idea that some people would say, well, if I just simply sin, I'm going to get more grace. He's addressed this earlier in chapter 6, but he comes back to it because it's such a pervasive idea. If God is always forgiving, then what does it matter whether I sin or I don't sin? In fact, if I sin, he might even give me more grace. So let me just go ahead and sin. And then he says, not after just by no means, he says, don't you know, that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves to the one you obey, whether you're a slave to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to life. Now here he is saying that here's the crux of the issue. Every time you choose sin instead of righteousness, you're not just getting more grace, but you are creating a bondage in your life. And so the issue isn't that God won't forgive you. It's that sometimes you will get so entangled with the sin that you won't know how to get yourself out of it. So take something that, maybe doesn't seem like a big deal. Let's take a little root of bitterness. You have somebody in your life who you feel like mistreated you in some way. And let's just for our sake say it's fairly minor mistreatment, not like some huge mistreatment. And so instead of extending forbearance, forgiveness, kindness, what you do instead is you nurse your grudge. You hold on to it. You sit with it and think about that constantly. And you rehearse ways that you might say something hurtful to the person in order just to let them pay a little bit for what they've paid you. Or secretly, maybe you kind of wish that something bad would happen. Well, if you allow that to continue, you could say, well, okay, I'm under grace. What's the big deal? God will forgive. But what this is saying is that every time you let those thoughts go, you become a little more obedient to sin, and sin leads to death, whereas resurrection, or the being a slave to righteousness, obedience, which leads to righteousness, is something that doesn't lead to death. And death here certainly can be ultimately the spiritual death, second death, all of those kinds of things. But it can also just be a word that stands for destruction in your life. And so the idea that says, I can just sin and God will forgive, doesn't take into account the reality that when you do that, when I do that, what we end up doing is we end up knitting ourselves in a sense of slavery to sin that makes it harder to get away from, and that brings destruction. So today, let me just ask you, where have you excused sin in your life because you've thought, oh, grace, I'm under grace. It's okay. It's not going to be a big deal. And are you potentially careening towards something destructive because you've been excusing God's good standard in your life?
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.